Jarek Blackthorn stood in front of the enormous alien, his dark combat armor reflecting the harsh lights of the grimy space station bar. The creature before him, a towering ovary named Zarvok, loomed over him by nearly 2 feet, its mottled, scales gleaming with an oily sheen. Behind the Oskari crime lord, 2 heavily armed guards stood, their weapons trained steadily on Jarek. "You want me to do what?" Jarek's deep voice was filled with a menacing edge. Zarvok's mandibles clicked, his eyes glinting with what passed for amusement among his kind. "I need you to acquire something special for my collection. A female Lunarian." Jarek's jaw clenched beneath his stubble. "I don't deal in slaves." "Then consider this a one-time exception," Zarvok replied, sliding a credit chip across the grimy table. 5 million credits. More than enough to buy the most exquisite specimen from the Nexus markets. "I want the most beautiful you can find." Jarek stared at the chip. "And if I refuse?" The alien's compound eyes narrowed, glittering with cold threat. "Then my associates will ensure your remains are scattered across 3 different star systems." Jarek picked up the chip, his enhanced reflexes noting the subtle shift in the guard's posture. "Why me?" "Because, human," Zarvok sneered, "you can pass through Nexus security without raising alarms. Unlike my kind, your species still maintains diplomatic relations with the Galactic Council." "You mean we haven't been caught running slave operations yet?" Jarek muttered darkly. "Precisely. You have 3 standard days. Don't disappoint me." As Jarek left the bar, his mind raced through various scenarios. The Nexus markets were a notorious black market hub, located within an abandoned mining station on the fringes of the galaxy. He had avoided the place for years, keeping some moral distance from the darker side of his profession. But now it seemed he had no choice. The journey to the Nexus markets took most of a day, even with his ship's advanced drive systems. Jarek spent the time brooding in the cockpit of his personal vessel, the Night's Edge, watching the swirls of hyperspace while trying to convince himself that this was just another job. The Nexus markets were as infamous as ever. The station was a sprawling labyrinth of interconnected modules, each specializing in different illegal goods. The slave market occupied an entire section, carefully hidden behind legitimate business fronts. Jarek's stomach churned as he moved through the crowded, dimly lit corridors, the air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and despair. Various alien species haggled over merchandise, their cold eyes assessing potential profits. The Lunarian section was smaller than the others. After the fall of their home world, their kind had become a rare commodity. Jarek found himself in a dimly lit chamber, where several transparent cells lined the walls. And then he saw her. She stood in the far corner of her cell, head held high despite her situation. Her skin, a soft shade of silver, seemed to glow in the low light. Her heterochromatic eyes, one blue, one green, locked onto him with an intense, challenging gaze. Her white hair cascaded down her back like a shimmering waterfall. "Magnificent, isn't she?" A gravelly voice interrupted his thoughts. Jarek turned to see a short, stocky alien with a crooked smile. "Full-blooded Lunarian," the alien continued. "Worth a small fortune." Jarek didn't bother hiding his disdain. "How much?" 10 million credits, the alien replied. Jarek shook his head. "Zarvok gave me 5. At the mention of the crime lord's name, the alien's eyes widened. "For you then, 5 million. The transaction was quick, businesslike. Within moments, Jarek found himself leading the Lunarian woman through the station's grimy corridors, her wrist bound by energy shackles. She hadn't spoken a word during the entire exchange. Once aboard the Night's Edge, Jarek deactivated the shackles. "I'm sorry about this," he muttered, looking away. The woman, her voice sharp with contempt, didn't hesitate. "Save your apologies, human. You're no better than the rest of them, trading sentient beings like cargo." Jarek clenched his jaw but held his ground. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," she shot back, rubbing her wrist where the shackles had been. "So, what now?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "You deliver me to whatever depraved creature purchased me." "Something like that," Jarek muttered, moving toward the cockpit. "I'm Jarek, by the way." I don't care what your name is, she replied coldly, though after a pause, she added, but since you asked, I'm Nova. As they approached a galactic customs checkpoint, the warning lights on Jarek's console flashed red. A stern voice crackled through the comms. Approaching vessel, this is checkpoint Alpha 12. Prepare for standard inspection. Nova, who had been silently observing from the co-pilot's seat, turned to Jarek with an arched brow. Well, this should be fun. What's your brilliant plan for explaining my presence? Jarek's mind raced. Smuggling a Lunarian through a checkpoint was a guaranteed death sentence. He had to think quickly. We need a cover story, and it has to be good. Nova smiled dangerously. How about we tell them the truth? You're involved in slave trafficking. Jarek snorted. I think they prefer the story where we're not both detained for contraband. Nova narrowed her heterochromatic eyes, calculating. Fine, she muttered, conceding. But what's your plan? Jarek sighed. We pretend to be a couple. Nova's eyes widened with indignation. You want me to pretend to be romantically involved with my captor? Would you prefer the alternative? Jarek snapped, his patience wearing thin. Nova remained silent for a moment, then broke into a musical laugh that caught Jarek off guard. Oh, this is rich. The mighty human reduced to begging his property for help. I'm not begging, Jarek growled. I'm trying to save both our skins. Fine, Nova said with a graceful sigh. But if we're going to do this, we're doing it my way. Before Jarek could respond, she moved fluidly through his personal space, adjusting his collar with deliberate fingers, allowing them to linger on his neck. First lesson in convincing others we're a couple, she said softly. Stop looking so tense when I touch you. Jarek forced himself to relax, though his heart rate quickened at her proximity. Her scent, intoxicating like starlight and exotic spices, filled the air. He reminded himself that this was all just an act. The docking procedure went smoothly, and soon they heard the heavy clang of the boarding tube connecting to their airlock. Nova had changed into some of Jarek's spare clothes, the fabric hanging loosely on her slender frame, but somehow making her look even more striking than before. Jarek leaned in close, whispering, Remember, we met at a trading post in the Outer Rim. You were a merchant's daughter. Nova cut him off with a light, patronizing pat on his cheek. Leave the talking to me, darling. As the airlock cycled open, they were met by 3 patrol officers, 2 humans and a towering Andromedian. Their eyes immediately locked onto Nova, her exotic appearance impossible to ignore. Documents, the lead officer demanded. Chapter 2, The Lie That Bound Them. Jarek took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. His heart was hammering in his chest, but his face remained an unreadable mask. He couldn't afford to let his nerves show. Not now, not when everything was on the line. The 3 patrol officers stood in front of him, their eyes fixed on Nova, whose cool, defiant expression never wavered. The lead officer, a tall human male with graying hair and a scar that ran from his jaw to his throat, studied them both for a moment before he spoke. What's this, then? His voice was gruff, but there was a hint of curiosity in his tone as he scanned Nova from head to toe. Nova, ever the master of reading a situation, stepped forward, standing just a bit too close to Jarek for comfort. She raised an eyebrow and gave the officer a smile that was equal parts charming and dangerous. We're traveling to the core worlds for a business arrangement, she said, her voice low and melodious, yet carrying an unmistakable authority. I'm the daughter of a merchant family from the Outer Rim. My father arranged this trip with Mr. Blackthorne. She gave Jarek a pointed glance, then continued. We've been together for several months now. He's an important business associate. Jarek barely managed to keep a neutral face at her words. Important business associate? He cursed under his breath. He had never been much of a liar, and pretending to be romantically involved with Nova was beyond his comfort zone. Yet, with her standing so close to him, he could feel the heat of her body and the weight of her gaze, and it was all he could do to keep his composure. The lead officer narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing their faces. He seemed to be weighing their story. You're telling me, human, he said, pointing at Jarek, that you're really with her? A Lunarian? Jarek kept his voice steady, even though every fiber of his being screamed at him to back out. Yes, he answered, forcing himself to speak with certainty. She's been with me for months now. I don't think there's any question about it. Nova placed a hand lightly on Jarek's arm, her touch deliberate, as if to further the illusion. Our connection is personal, she added, her voice smooth as silk. The officer glanced from Nova to Jarek, his sharp eyes flicking between them, before he looked over at the other two officers, who stood to the side, seemingly observing the exchange. The other two, a short, stocky human woman and the towering Andromedian, exchanged a quiet look, but neither spoke. The officer didn't seem entirely convinced, but after a long, tense silence, he motioned for the others to step forward. Fine, I'll let you pass this time. But know this. If I find out you're lying, I won't hesitate to report this. Nova's smile remained in place, though it was obvious to Jarek that she was controlling the situation with ease. You have nothing to worry about, officer, she said sweetly. We're just two people on their way to a new chapter of our lives. Jarek resisted the urge to roll his eyes. If only that were true. The lead officer gave them one last suspicious look before turning and signaling for the others to follow. You're cleared for docking. Move along. As the patrol officers turned away, Jarek exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. That went better than I expected, he muttered, but the tension still lingered in his shoulders. Nova smirked, stepping back to her seat. You should have known better than to doubt me. She winked, the mischievous glint in her heterochromatic eyes almost teasing. You're not bad at this whole lying thing either. Though I can tell you weren't exactly thrilled with the part about being romantically involved. Jarek shot her a look, though it wasn't as sharp as it could have been. It wasn't exactly part of my original plan. Nova's smile softened a fraction. You've had a rough day, haven't you, Jarek? She said it without any mockery this time, and for a brief moment, the distance between them seemed to close. Tell me something. Do you always follow orders without question? His eyes flicked to her, surprised by the sudden depth in her voice. Not always, he replied carefully, still unsure where this conversation was going. But sometimes there's no choice. People like Zarvok, they don't leave much room for negotiation. She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the stars outside the viewport. I suppose you could have said no and walked away, she said, her voice distant now. But you didn't. You chose the easier path, didn't you? Her eyes locked onto his. Just like me, Jarek didn't know how to respond to that. The truth was he hadn't really chosen anything. Zarvok's threat had been clear, and Jarek didn't particularly fancy the idea of being scattered across 3 different star systems. But Nova was right. He had followed orders without much hesitation, and she, in her own way, had made a choice too. Maybe, he muttered, maybe we both chose what we had to. She gave him a sharp look, then leaned back in her seat. Do you always speak in riddles, Jarek Blackthorn? Or is that part of your charm? He smirked, but it was a tired one. Maybe it's part of the job. Nova's lips quirked upward at the corners. I'll bet you think you have it all figured out, don't you? But what happens when things get complicated? Her voice took on a darker tone, and for a moment, Jarek could almost see the shadows of her past reflected in her eyes. Things always get complicated, Jarek replied. That's just how it goes. She didn't argue with him, just nodded, her gaze flicking back to the stars. The silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence, one filled with unspoken understanding. Jarek didn't know what was coming next, but something told him that his life had just become a lot more complicated. The rest of the journey was uneventful, though both Jarek and Nova seemed lost in their own thoughts. The checkpoint was behind them, but the real challenge lay ahead. Zarvok and whatever future awaited Nova after she'd been handed over to him. Jarek didn't know what he was going to do, but one thing was certain. He wasn't about to let Nova face whatever horrors awaited her alone. Where are we heading now? Nova asked, her voice pulling Jarek from his thoughts. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. We make one more stop, he said. Then we see where this all goes. Nova raised an eyebrow. You don't seem very confident about it. Jarek shrugged, the faintest hint of a grin tugging at his lips. Confidence isn't what keeps you alive out here. She returned his smile, a flicker of something in her gaze. And what does then? Jarek met her eyes for a moment, then focused back on the controls of the ship. Trust, he muttered. Sometimes it's all you've got. But even as he said it, Jarek couldn't shake the feeling that this time, trust was a fragile thing, easily shattered, just like everything else in the unforgiving galaxy. Chapter 3. The Ties That Bind. The hyperspace jump was over before Jarek had the chance to fully prepare himself. The sudden shift from the swirling depths of hyperspace to the vast blackness of real space always made his stomach flip, but this time, it felt different. There was a tightness in his chest that he couldn't shake, a gnawing feeling that had been growing ever since he left the Nexus markets. Nova sat beside him, her eyes narrowed as she gazed out the viewport, watching the stars streak past. The tension between them hadn't completely gone away after their narrow escape from the customs checkpoint, but it was different now. It wasn't just the unease from the lie they had to tell, or the dangerous path they were walking. It was something more, something unspoken. How much further? Nova's voice cut through the silence. She didn't look at him, but there was an edge to her tone. Not far, Jarek replied, his eyes flicking over the navigation console. We should be arriving in just a few hours. Good, she said, though her voice remained cool. I've been stuck on this ship for too long already. Jarek clenched his jaw, but said nothing. There was a subtle bitterness in Nova's words, but he couldn't blame her for it. She was a prisoner, in more ways than one, and no matter how much she tried to hide it, he could see the strain in her eyes. They were both trapped in this web now. They didn't have a choice, not if they wanted to survive. The ship's alarm suddenly blared, cutting through the tension between them. The warning lights flashed on the console, and Jarek's hand immediately went to the controls, his fingers flying across the keys. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. Nova's eyes snapped to the console, her posture immediately alert. What's happening? Jarek's mind raced as the ship's sensors indicated multiple incoming ships. We've got company, he said, his voice tight. Looks like a couple of bounty hunters. They must have gotten word of the transaction at the Nexus markets. We're being hunted. Nova shot him a sharp look, her heterochromatic eyes flashing. You didn't think this was going to be easy, did you? Jarek gritted his teeth. Of course not. It never is. The proximity alarm continued to blare, and the screens flashed with the signatures of 3 ships now closing in on them. 2 were small, agile fighters, likely bounty hunter ships, and 1 was a larger freighter, no doubt carrying more firepower. Jarek's mind raced. There was no way they could outrun them in the night's edge, not with their current speed and with that freighter on their tail. The bounty hunters would catch them sooner or later, and if they did, it was over for both of them. We need to make a decision, and fast, Jarek said, looking at Nova. If we don't fight back, they'll take us both. If we try to fight, we might end up dead before we even get close to our destination. Nova's lips curled into a sly smile, and Jarek couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. So, you're saying it's up to me to get us out of this mess? He didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the readouts. The ships were closing in fast. His pulse quickened. I didn't say that, he muttered, but if you've got a plan, now's the time to share it. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of intelligence and cold calculation. I have a plan, yes, she said calmly, but it requires your cooperation. Jarek raised an eyebrow, wary. Go on. Nova didn't hesitate. We make a run for it, she said. And I mean a real run, not this slow, painful escape. We jump out of here, and we take the fastest route we can find. I'll manage the ship's stealth systems while you handle the maneuvering. We'll need to be fast, unpredictable. And you think we can outrun them? Jarek interrupted, disbelief clear in his voice. Not outrun them, Nova replied, her eyes narrowing. We're going to make them think we've already jumped into another sector. We've got the tech to cloak us long enough for the freighter to lose its lock. And once it does, we can slip into the nearby asteroid belt and shake off the fighters. Jarek considered her words, weighing the risks. The idea wasn't perfect, but it might just work. It was the only option they had, really. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. Nova nodded. Good. Now let me take care of the systems. You focus on flying. Jarek didn't have time to question her, not with the incoming ships drawing closer. He adjusted his position at the controls and hit the acceleration. The Knight's Edge shot forward, the quiet hum of the engines growing louder as they rushed into space. The first enemy fighter appeared on his radar. and Jarek made a quick series of evasive maneuvers, pushing the ship to its limits. The craft shuddered under the pressure, but the engines held steady. He could feel Nova moving behind him, her hands flying across the console as she activated the ship's cloaking systems. Stealth mode engaged, she reported, her voice cold and steady. Jarek didn't wait for any more instructions. He slammed the throttle forward, sending the ship into a hard, sharp dive toward a nearby moon. His mind was clear, focused. The stakes had never been higher, but he had no intention of failing. The ship twisted and turned, narrowly avoiding a barrage of laser fire from the pursuing fighters. They were fast, but Jarek had the advantage of experience. He knew how to handle a ship under fire, how to push it to the limit. 5 seconds until we drop off the radar, Nova called out, her voice tinged with urgency. Get us to the belt now. Jarek didn't need to be told twice. He punched in the coordinates and slammed the emergency jump throttle. The stars outside the viewport blurred and shifted as they entered a brief phase of hyperspace, but only for an instant. As soon as they emerged, the freighter and its fighters would think they had jumped much farther out. Now! Nova barked, her voice tight with concentration. They entered the asteroid belt with barely a second to spare. The fighters and freighter wouldn't be able to follow them through the dense field of rocks and debris without risking severe damage. Jarek gritted his teeth and piloted the Knight's Edge through the maze of asteroids, his reflexes sharp, his focus absolute. For a few heart-stopping moments, the only sound in the cockpit was the pounding of his pulse as he dodged and weaved, avoiding the massive rocks that loomed in the darkness. He could see the enemy ships on his scanners, floundering as they tried to navigate the same terrain. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The ships pursuing them had lost the trail. Jarek exhaled in relief and slowly brought the ship to a halt, letting the engines settle into a quiet hum. We did it, he muttered, though the victory felt hollow. Nova didn't say anything at first. Then, after a long silence, she spoke with a tone that was almost respectful. You know, she said, I didn't think you had it in you. Jarek gave a small, tired smile. You don't know me very well? She laughed softly, the sound carrying a surprising warmth in it. I think I'm starting to. For a moment, Jarek just stared at the screen, watching the asteroid field drift past. The danger was over, but the real work had only just begun. They were still on the run, and their future was uncertain. But as he glanced at Nova out of the corner of his eye, something shifted in him. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than a simple job. Chapter 4, A New Path Forward. The asteroid belt was a maze of jagged rocks and dangerous debris, but the Knight's Edge sailed through it with ease. Jarek had his hands steady on the controls, his mind alert, even as the immediate danger had passed. The hunter ships had been shaken off, lost in the maze, and for now, they were safe. That was close, Nova said, her voice a little less cold now. She hadn't moved from her seat, her arms crossed, staring at the star field through the viewport. Jarek didn't respond at first. He needed a few minutes to compose himself, to let the adrenaline dissipate. The closer they got to their destination, the more he realized that what they were doing was dangerous, for both of them. He'd known it was dangerous from the start, but now it felt different. It wasn't just about the money or the mission anymore. It was about Nova too. You never told me where we're headed. Nova broke into his thoughts, her tone questioning but guarded. Jarek turned his gaze toward her. She looked so different now, more than just the stunning slave he'd purchased. There was a strength to her that he hadn't expected, a will to survive that matched his own, perhaps even exceeded it. I didn't tell you because I didn't think it mattered, he said, his voice low but firm. But now that we've gotten this far, I guess I should. Nova raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Jarek sighed, leaning back in his chair. He tapped a few keys on the console, and a star map appeared in front of them. His finger traced a line across the screen. We're headed to a remote system in the Hybrak sector. It's a place where people like us, people who want to stay off the radar, go. A hideout, she said, her voice soft with understanding. Exactly. There's a colony of outcasts and former mercenaries. It's where I've laid low before. If we can get there, we'll be safe for a while. Nova stared at him, for a long moment, her eyes calculating. And what happens when we get there? Jarek didn't flinch. I don't know yet, but I'm not turning you into anyone. You're not a piece of property. You're a person. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Nova didn't immediately respond. She simply stared at him, her face unreadable. That's unexpected, she said after a long pause, her voice softer than it had been. Most people in your position wouldn't care. I'm not most people, Jarek replied, his voice firm. They were silent for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling in. Eventually, Nova looked away from him, her eyes returning to the starfield outside. I didn't ask for this, she said, almost to herself. I didn't ask to be sold. I didn't ask to be used. Jarek clenched his jaw, his fists tightening on the controls. I know you didn't. But I'm not like Roth. I didn't buy you to use you. I did it because I didn't want anyone else to own you. Her gaze flickered back to him, a strange softness in her eyes for the first time since they'd met. Why? Because no one should be owned. Not even you. Nova was quiet for a long time. The only sound in the cockpit was the hum of the engines as the ship drifted through the asteroid field, finding its way toward the Hybrax sector. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. Why didn't you just walk away when Roth asked you to do this? Why risk everything for someone like me? Jarek turned in his seat to look at her fully. Because I've seen what happens when people are treated like property. I've seen enough to know it's wrong. And I couldn't live with myself if I just walked away. She seemed to study him for a long time, her eyes searching his face. You're not like other people, she said slowly, as if testing the words. Jarek didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded. I'm not. They fell into silence again, but it was different this time. There was no tension between them, no unspoken bitterness. For the first time, they both understood something unspoken. They were in this together, for better or worse. As the hours passed, they neared the edge of the Hybrax sector. Jarek's thoughts drifted back to their escape and what they would do when they reached the colony. It wasn't a long-term solution. They couldn't stay hidden forever. But it would give them time to figure out the next move. Time to think about what came next. He glanced over at Nova, who was now standing near the viewport, her silver hair shimmering in the dim light of the ship. She had her back to him, but he could see the tension in her shoulders had eased, her stance no longer rigid. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice low but sincere. For not treating me like a slave. Jarek was taken aback by the simplicity of her words, but they carried more weight than anything she had said before. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. But then he did what felt right. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Nova nodded slightly, her eyes softening. I know. As the Night's Edge entered the outskirts of the Hybrax system, the view outside shifted from the cold emptiness of space to the distant glow of a planet in the system's habitable zone. Jarek set the ship on a course toward the colony, the faint light from the planet casting a soft glow across the cockpit. The journey wasn't over yet. There would be challenges, dangers, and tough decisions ahead. But for the first time since he'd taken the job, Jarek felt a glimmer of something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Nova, too, seemed different now. The weight of her past was still heavy on her shoulders, but there was a new sense of purpose in her eyes. They were no longer just two strangers caught in a storm. They were something more, something bound by circumstance, yes, but also by choice. And as they neared their destination, Jarek couldn't help but wonder if this was the start of something he hadn't expected. Maybe, just maybe, he could find something worth fighting for after all.